Welcome, my friends, to another episode of the Chasing Poker Greatness podcast. Today is Friday, which is the most philosophical of all the days of the week. And I'm joined by my co-host for Philosophical Friday, Duncan. Duncan, what's up, sir?
Hello, hello, hello. How's everything going?
Everything's going quite well. Today we're talking about losing, right? That's what you've cooked up for both myself and the listener this week. And you had a retraction or an adjustment that you wanted to make from, was it last week's show?
That's correct. I mean, at some point I mentioned a quote, which was it was technically a half quote, and it was misquoted, meaning I basically used the wrong person. So I confused Schrodinger with Schopenhauer. They're quite different people. You know, one is a physicist and the other one is a philosopher, but they're both, you know, one of them is Austrian and the other is German. So the names sound very similar to me. But anyway, so the quote was from Arthur Schopenhauer, and I have it here. So I want to give it correctly, and I want to credit it to the right person. Basically, he said something along the lines of all truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. And finally, it is accepted as self-evident, right? So that was the quote about what's obvious. So obvious is not necessarily so, you know, sometimes they say that common sense is not that common, you know, things like that. So the obvious is not necessarily so, but and at the same time, it may take a considerable amount of effort to get there. So it's highly relative and it can be highly difficult. But anyway, I just wanted to get this out of the way. Expect a lot of inconsistencies and a lot of
those two guys can rest easy now. You have reconciled it. Your butchery is now
beautiful.
It's undone. So now everybody can sleep easy at night.
Right. So sometimes I explain to my students what statistics is, right? I mean, we sacrifice accuracy for an answer. And that's important because if we were trying to be 100% accurate in everything we're saying, we would not utter a single word. So it's okay sometimes. So we have to forgive ourselves. I'm saying that first and foremost to myself.
All right. So the listener is down for some more inaccuracies this week. Let's talk about,
there you go.
Let's talk about what we can get wrong. So on losing in poker specifically, right? That's today's topic of conversation. And I'll let you frame the topic for the listener and then we can dive in.
Yeah, I mean, we're eternal optimists, right? Like, so when I talk about something very optimistic, like losing, you know, all jokes aside, I think it has to do with the fact that, you know, understanding worst case scenarios sometimes can be a very calming effect, right? Because if we know how to handle the worst part of the game, that can actually be something very positive for our game. But anyway, that's the whole point of the conversation. We're not trying to be pessimistic for no reason. But anyway, so losing, would you say that losing is inevitable when it comes to poker, or do you think it's avoidable in some sense? This is a rhetorical question.
I think we skipped a step actually to really you know, when you mentioned the topic of losing, I thought of like, you know, there's like a different ways to lose in poker, many different ways. One is like more, I guess there's like macro and then like capital MACRO. The macro is like, you know, you would probably think of it in like a session based time frame. And then, you know, you could have like a month. How are you doing this month? How are you doing this year? How are you doing lifetime? I think all of those are like long time frames. And then also I think that there's very micro in each individual hand that you play, right? How are we determining losing? Is it whether or not we win or lose the pot? Is it whether or not you made a good decision in the hand that you played? Is it whether or not you played one specific street to the best of your ability, right? Chose one specific bet size, right? There's many different components. Even in the micro, you can get even more micro, nailing down into each individual decision that's made at the poker table. So yeah, I think that's the first thing that I would just like to clarify is like, you know, what is losing? How are we describing it and defining it?
Beautiful. So So we have, you mentioned what I would call horizontal dissection, right? So essentially what you're doing here, you're doing a horizontal dissection to different types of levels of losing within a specific domain. And that is the domain of monetary loss, right? At the same time, we can do some sort of like, I said horizontal, I actually meant vertical. I'm even doing that with my hand. Like I said, inaccuracies. so that is essentially the vertical decomposition. There is actually a horizontal decomposition where we can actually go in different aspects. For example, we can talk about the monetary loss, but at the same time we can talk about some sort of like a social loss, or some people even going to say, if you want to get spiritual about it, the loss of your soul, depending on how willing you are to go forward to
and
win,
emotional, right?
And
Like
emotional loss,
we had the
exactly.
emotional as well.
Exactly. Emotional loss, physical loss, monetary loss, all of those things. And all of these things are actually, I would argue, quite relevant, right? Because poker is a very taxing game, both physically and mentally. And it can also be very taxing to personal relationships. It can also be taxing to the relationships with people at the poker table. And of course, it depends how much people care about those things. And we can talk a little bit about that. So I guess we can differentiate between two types of dissections: the horizontal dissection and the vertical dissection. The horizontal dissection, again, being the different types of losses we can have as they relate to poker, and the vertical dissection will be the different levels at which we can have losses. And you described it perfectly, right? We can go at the really micro level, the hand we play, or even a street we play, or even, a specific bet that we're trying to dissect, like really zoom in, or we can zoom out a little bit, and then we can say, how we're doing poker-wise, lifetime, this month, this year, what have you.
Correct. And I really like the way that you frame that, because there are, with everything in life, right? Like, we're going to talk about this at some point, but like risk, there's risk and a cost to everything that we do. And playing poker, there's a cost, right? There's opportunity cost, there's relationship costs. All of these things, like they just happen somewhat naturally, and maybe we don't think about them all the time, but they are nonetheless relevant and there. So I guess to answer that first question, is losing inevitable? I think the podcast listener can probably guess what I'm about to say. Losing's not inevitable. No. Yes,
You
of
heard it
course.
here first. Breaking news.
Breaking news. Yes, of course. Losing is going to happen, and losing is inevitable. So that first question, I think I can pretty much answer pretty conclusively that there is some form of loss here. And my assumption that when we were discussing what we were going to talk about today, that the portion of losing that was most relevant were the individual sessions, monetarily based.
Right. That's correct. And the only thing I would add is that not only losing is inevitable, but I would also say it is okay. It is a fact of life. And what's interesting about poker is that all of these different domains that we described earlier, both horizontal and vertical, they're very similar to one another. They involve some sort of like taking a risk, like you said, Brad, and then having a potential reward and a potential loss. This is not necessarily the case in many other aspects of life. Like, for example, for an accountant, yes, there's obviously risks. Like, for example, if somebody cuts corners, that's a risk that they're taking, and then there's a potential risk and reward. So there are some risks and rewards at the meta level, but at what they're doing, their jobs day in and day out, the hourly rate of the accountant is not so much, they're not taking risks for a living. So there is a difference between what they actually do and the meta that it goes around their job, which is, again, the relationship with the co-workers and everything else. With poker, everything is sort of like a risk reward, including our actual jobs. So that's what I think is very interesting, which is why I have this strong feeling that poker can teach us huge lessons about life in general, and also we can draw lessons from life itself and apply them to poker.
Yeah, I agree. So what's the first point here that we're going to dive into?
Sure.
I guess we've passed the first point. We're 3 or 4, the next point,
The
I
next
guess.
point, exactly.
Yeah.
So one of the points is a lot of people, and a lot of newer players and maybe even more experienced players as well, they're not 100% sure on that. How often should professionals expect to lose realistically? And then we can maybe break that down both for cash games and for tournaments. We can talk again at different levels, but let's start with a simple question. Like, how many sessions on average does a winning cash game player expect to lose? And this, of course, is a heuristic. I mean, I'm sure you have data. I know I have a lot of data myself. I see you're smiling there. Go
Well,
for it, Brad.
it's like the classic, it depends, right?
Mm-hmm.
On very specific variables, like what is your win rate?
Right.
What is your skill level relative to your competitor's skill level? So like that's really the first place, because I mean, if you're like torching, right? If you're have a giant loss rate, well, you're gonna lose quite often.
Right.
If you're crushing, well, you're still gonna lose quite often. I mean,
Right.
let's be real here. I don't really have any hard numbers
Okay.
to say for this situation, but I would say probably 40% of the time,
Right.
somewhere in the range of, I don't know, 30, probably like 35 to 49% of the time. Something around there would be my guess.
Exactly. And that would depend again how much of a winning player that person is. And yeah, I mean, I've done some research on the topic, and also, like from personal experience and from my friends and huge databases as well. And I would say roughly the rule that I'm giving is like something like 2-1. For every 2 winning sessions, 1 losing session. So like around the 35% mark, 40% mark, again, depending on the situation, depending on, like, we're not going to split hairs here. You're just like a quick heuristic. But this is a very, very common situation. Every 3 sessions, like 1 loss, like give or take, and something like that for cash games, for winning, consistent winning players, depending on their win rate.
Right. And like, I think that for the listener, it's important to know that like, even if like you're losing 40% of the time, there's nothing that says that you can't lose 10 times in a row. Like, it's
Correct.
within the realm of possibility here when we're talking about these types of runs,
Correct.
which can feel quite bad. I don't know. I mean, this is Philosophical Friday, so I'm allowed to do whatever I want, right?
Exactly.
It's kind of a sandbox.
Go for it, Brad.
Could I just reject the premise
Yeah.
of losing in
Yeah.
general? Because
Yeah.
like, this is something that like I've thought a lot about. I've thought a lot about loss, and we have some questions about like how do we handle losing,
Mhm.
all of these sorts of things. And to tell an anecdotal story here,
Mhm.
there's a crusher in the group who a while back said, "Wow, I'm on a big downswing. I'm stuck 15 buy-ins since the start of the month, right? It's 2 weeks into the month. However, on the last 3 months combined,
Yeah.
they're winning like 80 buy-ins, right?
Heaps. Yeah. Mhm.
So is this a downswing, right? And like, so how do we say that this is like a loss, right? Because it isn't a loss. It depends on how far you zoom out and kind of look at your graph, right? If you zoom in, you can see the downs, but if you zoom out as a professional, the graph is typically going up, right? And so the reality is like, there's many ways to lose, and so I just don't think that like focusing on things that are beyond your control are ultra important. So like, you're going to misplay a hand. You can have a winning session and feel like you lost because you mess a hand up. Trust me. I promise that this can be the case. So the reality is like, I try to approach any sort of loss like that these days in a more evolved state than I was when I was 20 years old, through a long time. I don't know exactly when the switch happened, but like, I try to look at everything with curiosity. Whenever I make a mistake, like, I wonder why I made that mistake. That's interesting. Like, I don't know if this is like a good decision here, but I'm going to make it and kind of see what happens. And then the feedback that I get is like, that's interesting, right? Like, what can I learn from what happened here? And so in this way, like, I just try to reframe like all of these quote unquote losses as just opportunities to learn in the micro, and really bank on the fact that like, if I am doing the best that I can on a micro level, then the macro just works itself out naturally as a side effect to the micro. And just try to handle playing poker professionally through that lens, if that makes sense. So like to me, losing and winning, they are things that happen, but it's also like really we're playing the game for the rest of our lives. The one thing we can control are our decisions, and then we let the chips fall where they may. So in that sense, like I'm trying to depersonalize loss, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And actually, it brings a point which has been discussed very frequently philosophically several times. And it's an idea which I personally like to call the locality principle. So there is, when it comes to viewing our lives, there's two lenses from which we can view our lives. Like you said, from really, really, really far away, and realize that this is actually a very steep going up graph when it comes to poker. Let's say you're a winning player and you look, you zoom out, you see basically a 45, 60 degrees. It doesn't really matter. I mean, it all depends on the axis anyway, on the units you're using. So 45, 60 degrees angle, like steep graph going up all the time. And then you zoom in, and all of a sudden you see like a little dent going down, right? And I mean, that so happens to be the right now for you at that point. This is what I would call the locality principle. And the issue is that as human beings, we cannot always process the information in its entirety, because it would be information overflow, right? We cannot at all times have all of our sessions in our head, right? And this has nothing to do with poker. This is just how we're wired. We cannot, for example, a perfect example would be family. Why do we care more about the people that we see, or the people that they are around us? Because these are the ones that affect us the most. But at the same time, there's so much brain power and energy we can concentrate on things and other humans. Otherwise, we will have an overflow. This is the same with poker. When we are in a session, we concentrate our focus on that specific session. So the necessity for concentration is one that has to do with our survival, which is the reason why we sort of like single out that one session that we're playing right now, and it feels like it's the world to us, right? But
Yeah.
but it's also the same reason why it explains, why people, would care. There's a very famous picture of that, where people, once, they see a picture of a young child in Africa, like, that child has a name, and they see the name, and now they're thinking about that child, they have that image, and they're more likely to donate versus if somebody gives like an abstract idea of a child. And that's because, again, somebody triggers the proximity principle, the locality principle, the idea that now it becomes part of my very limited neighborhood of thoughts, right?
Right. It's personalized.
It's
And feels
personalized.
more personal. And there's another, I have another story that's quite different than generously giving to people in other countries who are less fortunate.
Right.
One of my favorite podcasts is Hardcore History with Dan Carlin, and he was talking about World War II, and basically the proximity principle in this situation as it relates to warfare is that the closer you are to someone when you kill them, the more it fucks you up.
That's right.
If you shoot somebody from 2 miles away, it's not as personal as stabbing somebody in the heart right next to them, right? And like basically the closer that you get to someone, the more, the bigger toll it takes on you emotionally. And I think that like we can all sort of understand this, where you drop a bomb from 200 miles away and it hits the enemy, that's quite different than shooting them at point blank range, right? It's more emotional. It's just more personal, and will have a much larger effect on you because you're closer in proximity, which, tying that into poker, right? Like we're always in the current session that we're playing. And so we're always closest to that. So it makes sense that we're going to feel that one session way more viscerally than we feel all the sessions that we've played over the past month. And to be honest with you, as you said, we're hardwired to feel that way. I don't necessarily think that it's something you can just not do or undo. I think that it's something you just have to experience and go through and then recover and come out the other side.
That's exactly right. And to your point, by understanding that this is something that we cannot avoid or escape from, we do understand that it's inevitable. But then here comes exactly what you said, the zooming out, So we know that we may have to put some effort into that zooming out. That zooming out is also useful. It's a different type of process, but at least by knowing that, okay, now, right now,
Gut reaction when you have
exactly.
a session that tortures you, right?
That's right.
And
No,
somebody says zoom out. What's your response? What's your gut instinct reply?
no. I mean, it's probably F you, right? So, but
Yeah, that would be
that's
fine.
right.
Fuck off. Let me deal with this right now.
Right. But my point is, however, that I think the hardest part for us, to get out of that situation is, at least, again, many of that stuff that I'm saying, I'm speaking about from personal experience and for myself. It may be different. Your mileage may vary, but one of the things is that I always felt to myself, you know what? No, you shouldn't be thinking like that, Duncan. Don't be weak, right? What I'm trying to say is that it's okay that we are affected by the proximity principle. So it's okay to say, you know what, right now I'm angry. I'm a slave of the proximity principle at this point, and that's okay. That's what human being is. And it's okay when I have to do this. It's going to hurt. It's going to suck. But at the very least, we understand the type of situation that we're going through. It's not like we're failing in something. Oh my God, everybody's so zen. They can actually zoom out whenever they want. And I'm a slave to my own emotions. And no. This is just reality. That's what I'm trying to say. So it's okay to be entrapped temporarily in that proximity principle. We can always, when things,
I think it's more than okay. I think it's essential.
it's essential. It's humanity. It's who we are, right? I mean, we can't be humans without that principle. Like, we're so hardwired. There's a reason for that. It prevents us from, again, information overflow and having to prioritizing the things that matter in our survival. So you can do, however, what Brad said, when things relax, because then you're out of the session. It's no longer in your proximity range. So now at that point, you can actually go back, and then you can even tell to yourself, you know what, I've been there before. I feel like crap right now, but I remember it has happened to me dozens of times before. I will be able to zoom out after the session is over, or in a week from now. It doesn't matter. I know I'm going to get out of this. And that alone can be helpful.
Yeah, and I think this brings up a very important point as it relates to the people who are close to us, friends, spouses, just whoever, because this thing happens, like, at least it happens in my experience, right? Where something, a session goes poorly, right? And as you said, if somebody says, it's okay, don't worry about it, these things happen. This happened last week. Like, you'll be fine. Remember, like, you were fine before you played. You'll be fine afterwards, right? And the initial, like, gut reaction is like, F you, right?
Leave me alone.
Leave me alone, right? Like, let me process this. Let me
Exactly.
process my emotions and my loss. And
that's right.
I think the ironic part is that these people are trying to be helpful, right? They're trying to be supportive and helpful, and they don't want to see you in pain. They don't want to see you hurting. But the reality is, like, you are going to be in pain. And the thing that kind of accidentally happens on their end is that they're they're not validating how you feel in the moment, right? You feel invalidated, right? Like, that you shouldn't be feeling the way that you feel.
Exactly.
Because it happened last week, and you will eventually get better, right? And I think that's where, like, the disconnect is in communication between, like, your friends, your spouse, and you in these pretty important moments. And so it is very important to communicate, like, right now, when this podcast is over, like, and you're in a stable frame of mind, like, how we process this loss and how you feel in this moment. And it doesn't mean that, like, you don't love this person when you're frustrated and you're like, no, like, step back here. Like, you need validation, right? That it's okay to feel disappointed. Right. It's okay to be upset with yourself. Yes. It's okay that right now you feel as if, in effect, your world is crumbling for this period of time so that you can eventually recover. So anyway, that's sort of like a communication issue that popped in my mind that I think is quite relevant for poker players and the people that they're around, is that, like, tell them, just let them know that you need validation and that these things are biological, and that eventually you will be okay. But validation is the thing that, like, is necessary, like, in those moments where, you're heated on the inside, you're quite emotional. You're not thinking rationally or logically. We just want to feel that like this feeling is okay.
Exactly. Exactly. It is absolutely okay. And one of the lessons that poker taught me, exactly to your point, is give people space when people are frustrated. This is something that poker helped me a lot realize, that sometimes because I'm a problem solver by nature, so I have this you're smiling, that can be very annoying. That's one of the things that I became hopefully less annoying, because I used to be very annoying, like trying to get into the root of the problem and solve it. I go from good intentions, like I want to solve the problem. But one of the things that I realized, give people space. Sometimes people need their space. Give them space to process, and there's always going to be time to resolve the issue. Do not get me wrong. Something that I also want to mention, I think culturally we're in a situation where, communication, like you said, communication is a problem. We don't communicate things well. Sometimes we don't communicate things at all. I do believe that when there are issues, no matter how uncomfortable they are, issues need to be discussed eventually. Otherwise, they will just build up and blow up eventually. That doesn't, to me, in my mind, that doesn't change. However, there are situations where people need to process. And processing, I think, is very important and needs to be respected. And it's basically understanding the proximity principle, understanding what the proximity neighborhood is for the person next to us, and just let them be and give them space and time for as long as they need.
Yeah, and I want to be explicit in saying that I am the world's worst when it comes to this as well, right? Like as
We
someone
can
who's like
compete.
genuinely cares about my friends,
Right.
my wife, my kids, all these things. You want to help. You feel this need to solve the problem. But I'll quote Nick Howard, and I'm not going to actually retract this quote if I butcher it, Nick. I'm sorry. I'm not as good-hearted, good-natured as Duncan is.
Don't
But
know about that.
uh, basically, Nick tweeted at one point that you can't help somebody until they know that you care, right? And I think that is very applicable to what we're talking about here. That unless that person knows that you genuinely care about what they're going through, you can't help them
Right.
because you haven't validated their emotions and what's going on there.
Right. Right. No, this is excellent. I could not agree more. And that actually beautifully brings us to the next point. So, how can we handle losing efficiently? Whether it's we're talking at a horizontal level, at a vertical level, it doesn't matter. Like, how do we handle losing in poker efficiently? And what are perhaps some heuristics, some things you have tried yourself, some things that other people can try, or anything that goes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, so again, I'm going to lean on Nick because Nick
Mm-hmm.
is this is his world, and communication is like, yeah, I very much respect all of his thoughts in this realm. He said at some point that recovery is the highest level of poker performance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a, it's
Mm-hmm.
it's a transcendent way to train to perform at a high level. So I would start there, that we've established that because of the proximity principle, and that because we are emotional creatures who have cognition, we are going to respond emotionally in our losses. When they happen, it's hardwired, it's inevitable. So the thing to focus on from that point is recovery, right? And recovery is a return to something. It is a return to a previous state, which in this case, it would be a return to your A game, a return to, just your normal self, right? So I would focus on recovery and understanding what it is to recover, what you can do to recover more efficiently, sitting with your emotions and the feeling of loss, asking yourself why losing is so meaningful to you, right? Why does it matter if I win or lose? What is this tied to, right? Because a lot of times it's anchored into our identity at a very young age. Um, and so like basically whatever you can do to try to recover more efficiently from session to session, from hand to hand, from day to day, the faster you're able to recover. If you could just imagine somebody who's a master at recovery, they take a terrible beat that is almost certainly going to ruin their night and maybe ruin their week or their month.
Mm-hmm.
And they feel all the emotions that need to be felt, they process them, and they're able to recover before they get the next hand dealt to them, right? Like that would be the peak of poker performance, right? That is quintessentially your A game, just playing on your A game all the time, right? Which is something that, you can strive for. I don't know if it's actually possible, but that to me would be how to like systematically go about dealing with loss, is trying to improve your ability to recover, whatever that means. And I know that through various stages of my career, there have been some losses that have taken a week to recover from. There have been sometimes where you just nothing goes right, and you just have to shut it down and go to sleep, and you need a full sleep cycle to recover and put in volume. But if you can recover quickly and efficiently, you can play more volume, you can put in more hands, you have a higher hourly rate, you cut out a lot of the punting that can go on when you're not fully recovered. So anyway, that's sort of my take on losing efficiently.
Absolutely, and recovery is such an important concept there. I would add to this, Brad, that it actually is valuable to stay in the negative territory for prolonged periods of time. I mean, you mentioned, quick recovery is a good thing, and it has absolutely its benefits, but sometimes staying in the negative territory, right? I mean, we can call it the territory of soon to be recovered, territory.
Yeah,
right?
well, so the way that I frame this to like John, because a lot of high performers, right? They try to game the system, right? Like, and this is like John's way of trying to game the system in a program that I ran. I've ran it multiple times, but this case it was like a year and a half ago or so, called the Elite Program. And so classic example, he's playing poker, playing very well, right? It's like a rare play and explain video where I'm watching it and I'm like, man, he's like on fire today. I'm seeing no mistakes, and then all of a sudden encounters a spot that he's unsure about, ends up getting stacked, and all of a sudden like has quote unquote brain farts on all of his tables kind of simultaneously. The last 30 minutes of the play and explain were a horror show, which was great for me because then we had stuff to talk about. My biggest fear is like, holy shit, I'm gonna watch this whole thing and there's nothing to talk about, right? And so like this was in John's mind when we're in the Elite Program, right? Because he wasn't able to recover in that session, and that we talked a lot about how he wasn't recovering. So he had an idea to game the system of like, well, if that's the case, if I'm going to ruminate on that situation, it's going to cause my play to deteriorate, I'm going to play Zoom. That way, I'm going to just play so many hands that if I make a mistake, I won't have time to ruminate. I just got to move on to the next hand, right? And that failed about as spectacularly as you could imagine.
And just a small parenthesis here, because remember, problems will always come back and bite you in the ass, right? I mean, it doesn't matter, how deep you're digging them. So the point we're trying to say earlier is that it's okay to suffer. It's okay. I shouldn't say suffer. It's okay to feel hurt. Suffering, I guess it's a different concept, is voluntarily thinking about something when you don't have to. But it's okay to feel the pain, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be addressing the problem. Sorry for interrupting.
Emotions are meant to be felt. Right. And so like the saying that I use a ton in the Elite Program is like the only way out is through, right? You can't go around. You have to go through, which means that you do have to sit with these emotions. You can't bury them. You can't place them to the side to be dealt with at a determined time later on. Just sit with how you feel. You're an emotional creature. Sit with that emotion, and feel it. And then, you're able to better recover, more quickly recover, and actually deal with what's going on in your central nervous system rather than just ignoring it, which is a big recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. And just finish the point from earlier, because some listeners may like, where was that thread going? When you stay in the, I guess we can call it the injured state, right? So you have your normal state, you get injured and then you recover. But between, the time you get injured and you recover, and I'm using injured metaphorically, of course, and the time you recover, we can call it the injured state. Staying inside the injured state, I can think of like 4 people at least. We either have mentioned or they're constantly in my mind. You can think of Nietzsche. you can think of Edison, you can think of the antifragility of Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and of course, the one and the only David Goggins, right? The idea of basically, you can get hurt, but not really hurt if you don't allow other people to hurt you, essentially, right? The idea that you can get inside those zones and train yourself, learn something out of it, like mistakes. Again, the Edison principle, we can learn so much. Mistakes are a gift. We can learn so much from our mistakes. It's actually surprising why people don't wish for mistakes more frequently, right? I mean,
and replace mistakes with loss, and it stays the same.
Exactly correct. And then we have, of course, that idea that Nietzsche has talked a lot about the idea that, like don't be afraid to, which it ties very much to the Taleb's antifragility. None of these ideas are new. I mean, they're all tied, they're all standing in the shoulders of other giants. But all of these ideas that, like he's superhuman, or Ubermensch, if we want to, use the French term, because people hate the superhuman, but it's all words, people. Let's not be hang on those things. But anyway,
who's sending you messages and emails about Superman, Duncan? Who hurt you? You have some recovery to do, I think, in that area.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. I have a lot of, trust me, I have to do a lot of recovery in a lot of areas, Brad. Don't get me started on that. So, but the concept of actually staying within that injured space and getting better as a result of it, right? I mean, becoming stronger. I mean, of course, like Kelly Clarkson would say, right? What doesn't kill you makes you. Wow. I had to say that. I had to say that. I mean, we have to.
Yeah, see, it's in your contract. You're contractually obligated to mention Kelly Clarkson one out of every 10 shows.
Absolutely. So, no, I mean, in all seriousness, though, it is true, right? And this is probably like one of the most cliches, but that's the idea of antifragility, right? The idea that we need stressors, and those stressors will actually get us out of our comfort zone. And by being out of our comfort zone, first of all, we're going to feel discomfort. That's the definition of being out of our comfort zone. However, we're also training our bodies, our minds, and everything in between to be stronger and be able to deal with those new uncomfortable situations.
And for the listener that may not be familiar with anti-fragile as a term or concept, basically, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Duncan, but fragility is something that's in a state that when it is changed, it is bad for the thing. So imagine a coffee cup in its state, right? You drop a coffee cup on the ground, it shatters into a million pieces. It's worse off than it was before it got dropped. And anti-fragile is something that you drop, but instead of it going to pieces, it actually makes it stronger. So it is in the chaos. It grows in strength rather than, shatters into a million pieces.
Exactly right, which is, by the way, very difficult to imagine, because if you look at material objects around you, most material objects are either fragile. So in other words, if you put a little bit of volatility, they will actually destroy themselves, or they're robust, which means if you actually throw like a rock, nothing is going to happen to it, right? So, but antifragility is not robustness. This is the important point that Taleb is making very clearly in his book, right? Antifragility is the opposite of fragility. In other words, you get stronger. Imagine a cup that becomes a super cup after you actually throw it into the floor, right? So we cannot think about material objects because there are not many good examples. Instead, humans are, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to use a superhero example, right? Like a superhero example that can steal the powers of other superheroes when they use those powers on him, right? It's like,
that's right.
You just absorb the ray, and now you're stronger because you were exposed to the ray, right?
Right. I don't even remember the name of there was a TV show called Heroes a bunch of years ago. I don't remember the name.
Siler.
Siler. Yes. Okay, very good. Now my brain can rest. Siler. I was about to say Cylon, but that's a different one. That's like Galactic. All right, too many shows. All right, excellent. No, that's exactly right. That is exactly.
It's a practical example, better than a superhero example of anti-fragility in the real world.
Working out at the gym, micro tearing. You go at the gym, you're working out your muscles, essentially what you do temporarily, and that's why you feel sore afterwards. You're damaging your muscles. So you're doing something, quote unquote, bad. And I shouldn't say bad, but the correct term would be volatility, right? You're adding stressors. You're adding stressors to your muscles. And that's why, by the way, if you hear people talking about stress, the first thing we will tell you is that not all stress is bad. And that's because we are meant to sort of like not only handle stressors, but actually get better out of stressors. But there's a difference between, let's say, trying to lift, I don't know, like 20, 30, 40 pounds and going and trying to lift, like 3 million pounds, right? I mean, 3 million pounds will crush you, but 30 or 40
Yeah,
pounds
it'll
will actually
crush you. Speak for yourself, Duncan.
I see what you did there. Yes, I love this podcast, man.
No, this is great stuff. Yeah, like what's the final point here? Because I think
Sure.
we've covered a lot of ground, and yeah, this is like feels like it would be a decent stopping point.
Sure. Since again, I mean, we're talking about antifragility here, and I guess one quick follow-up on that would be: is it possible for losing to wear us down, and how do we prevent that from happening, perhaps? Or what are some thoughts that we should have about essentially a wear and tear, right? Because again, we talked about the difference between lifting 30 pounds and lifting 3,000 pounds, right? So how do we make sure that we lose, but at the same time, we don't destroy ourselves in the process of
Yeah,
losing?
I have no idea because I don't know the threshold
Good.
for personal destruction. It's not. I don't think that's a question that I could answer. I would say that you burn a lot of energy by ruminating, by stewing, by not dealing with your emotions, so that effectively, if you're not dealing with emotions, right, then they're just going to keep manifesting,
Mm-hmm.
and so you're just constantly dealing with them again and again and again and again and again. And I think that that's an easy path to burnout. I think that's an easy path to breaking down. So for me, it's like, deal with what's going on in your central nervous system and honor that and respect that. Give it the space that it needs. And don't just try to bury it, because I think like burying your emotions in that way is what ultimately leads to collapse.
Absolutely. I think that's a very important takeaway. Do not bury it, deal with it. But at the same time, again, one can respect the proximity principle. Deal it means deal with it eventually and incrementally, right? That would be another thing, another heuristic. So how do we know what our boundaries are without testing them, right? But again, you don't go to 3,000 from 30. From 30, you go to 31, and then to
Sure.
32, to 40. So one potential heuristic way to see how much of that is actually good stressors versus bad stressors would be to incrementally test them, right? And that's different from person to person. So one example would be, how comfortable or uncomfortable and for how long you feel with certain amount of losses. And that way somebody can actually adjust their stop losses, right? I mean, it's different from person to person, right? That would be an example. One can adjust their stop losses to the point where they're thinking that, oh, you know what, that if I put my stop losses right there, it's a little bit higher than I did before, right? So that's going to make me uncomfortable. But at the same time, I'm going to train myself a little bit. How am I going to feel? But what would be potentially a dangerous territory would be, oh, I had my stop losses at X, and all of a sudden, the next day I just want to try a 10X, just some crazy multiplier. So incremental change is exactly the same way. Think of gym, right? Hopefully you don't go to the gym and one day, you're trying like the 5-pounders, and then the next day you go to 50-pounders. That would probably be not, the wisest of choices, even if you're very strong, like Brad.
Another thing here that could probably be a whole podcast episode in and of itself is try to avoid comparison with other players, with other people.
Right.
You are you, and the only thing to compare yourself against is you.
That's right.
So yeah, just try to compare how you dealt with a devastating loss last week with how you dealt with a devastating loss this week, and take measures to improve your ability to deal with this sort of emotional pain. Just think about yourself only. Don't compare yourself to other people. Just because somebody else has like a giant tolerance and threshold doesn't mean that you necessarily have one, doesn't mean that it's innate. I think these things, there is some genetics and biology as it relates to like risk taking, risk aversion, and risk inclination. And then also pain tolerance, in the same way that like, there's genetics involved in how much you can bench press, right? Some people have a much higher ceiling than other people, and that's just like kind of dims the brakes.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And what you're saying, Brad, about, comparing yourself to who you were yesterday, essentially, or who you are, or comparing yourself to yourself versus other people, is spot on. The one thing that I want to say is that proximity principle, again, is real. So someone may think, well, that's easier said than done. And actually, I would agree with that, right? Because just a very quick aside, which I think people will find that very entertaining. There's a very interesting speech that Malcolm Gladwell gave at, I believe it was at Google at some point. And that speech was basically, he did some research, and he was trying to basically answer a question that I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but the basic idea was the following: who's going to be more successful? Somebody who is, like, let's say, at the bottom of their class on really high institution, or somebody who's, like, let's say, at the top of the class on a very mediocre institution? And as you can imagine, if somebody follows the proximity principle, it doesn't matter what kind of institution you're coming from. What matters really is how you compare to your peers, because that sort of like builds confidence. And actually, people who were doing the best in very mediocre, whatever that word may mean, because again, any institution is an institution. If you study, it doesn't really matter, but that's another story. Like, those people did incredibly well. And there was famously, some Harvard graduates that basically sort of like had struggled with their lives just because they were not in the top of their class. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that the proximity principle is very real, right? So one thing that I would add to that, thing of, try to compare yourself to yourself, is try to manufacture that proximity principle to work in your favor. And again, I'm not going to pretend that I have like the magic recipe that is working for everybody, but an example of that would be if you, for example, you're into spreadsheets, and if you're trying, for example, to measure your own performance, that would be an example of a manufactured proximity principle, because now it's you and your spreadsheet. So the only one you're comparing yourself to is yourself, your same self, but with yesterday, right? So by creating environments where you are basically different versions of yourself, now the proximity principle only sees yourself versus other people. I hope I articulate that somewhat clearly. The point is, try to make the proximity principle work in your favor. Like, don't try to make assessments while you're sitting at the poker table when there's other people, other professions and stuff like that, for example.
Yeah, be still my beating heart. You cut right to my soul there on spreadsheeting. You have no earthly idea how near and dear spreadsheeting is to my heart.
Right.
I can't express it. People may think I'm joking, but
No.
both John and Shu and you as well probably know just how near and dear spreadsheeting is to my heart.
That's just on my desktop right now. I think I have, I believe, 12. I see 12 Excel spreadsheets, right? Just on my desktop, like not in any folder. So
yeah, there you go. Well, man, yeah, it's been a great episode of Philosophical Friday on loss. I think we've actually sort of dredged up other topics for future episodes, including, comparison and things like that. So as always, if you have any questions stemming from this episode of Chasing Poker Greatness, hit Greatness Village at greatnessvillage.com. Join the Philosophical Friday discussion channel. Ask your questions. Me and Duncan will respond whenever we can, but we typically respond to most everything that's said in said channel. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next week.
Absolutely, Brad. It's been a pleasure.